Thank you all for being with us. We're going to get started, and we've got about an hour, and hopefully what we're going to do today is have a discussion and not just answer a bunch of questions, but have everyone really do a back and forth about the Texas coast. And I'm stealing words either out of Dr. McKinney or David Yaskowitz or Greg Stunz, but we really need for Texans to be thinking about Texas as a coastal state and not just a state that happens to have a coast. We've got about a quarter of our population that lives in the 18 coastal counties. We've got a quarter of the economy that's driven by the Texas coast. And so we wanted to really talk about the changes that are occurring there. It's a place that, as Dr. Stunz and others know in the room, that's just part of the evolution of the coast. It does change, but as you heard from Sarah earlier and from a few others, it's changing at a rapid pace, more rapid than maybe we've seen in the last few decades or so. And so we want to talk about those changes. We want to talk about habitat loss. We want to talk about industry, even marine debris. We're going to touch on some of that as well, and how the rest of what you heard from that previous panel, the rest of Texas through our watersheds are connected to the Gulf. So my name is Jay Kleberg, and I'm the executive director of the Gulf Trust. And I'm going to let these folks introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the conversation.
All right. Is it on? You hear me? Okay. I'm Greg Stunz. I'm the executive director of the Harte Research Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And we're a marine institute that does a lot of conservation work and a lot of science to make the Gulf a better place.
And my name is Bob Stokes. I'm the director of the Galveston Bay Foundation. I've been in that role for almost 21 years at this point in time. Time flies. Our mission is to preserve and protect the natural resources of Galveston Bay. And we do a lot of different programming around that. We do habitat restoration, we do land conservation, we do water protection work, we do education primarily with kids, and then we do research and advocacy as well.
And my name is Kirsten Sorensen. I am the Research and Cleanups Program Manager for Keep Texas Beautiful. We're a statewide nonprofit with an affiliate-based model, which really means we're supporting around 250 communities across Texas doing work locally in their communities, from rural recycling efforts to litter cleanups and prevention to youth programs and education as well. And so I manage our statewide litter cleanups as well as a project called the Texas Litter Database, which is the first statewide litter database of its kind, trying to measure the impacts of litter, map it at its source, and learn a little bit more about how we can make evidence-based decisions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Moake. I work in the role of Director of Regulatory Strategy for Cheniere Energy. My background is in really all things coastal, ranging from planning, permitting, engineering, and construction of bird islands and beach nourishments to channel improvement projects, heavy marine industry, and by way of those experiences, I've ended up collaborating with most of the people on this panel and some of you out there in some way, shape, or form over the last 20 years. So nice to see the familiar faces and meet some new ones, and thanks for having me.
Well, good afternoon. My name's Jeff Branick. I'm the county judge in Jefferson County, Texas, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico where Texas butts up against Louisiana. You're Beaumont, Port Arthur. I have a liberal arts degree and a law degree, so I'm probably the only non-scientist of this group, but I think as county judge, we started working in 2007 after Hurricane Rita, and I think under the Restore Act, we've done probably the largest project for coastal restoration and protection that's been done. I think our total funding from all sources so far has been about $235 million, and we've got more work to do, so it's my pleasure to be here today. Since I'm not a scientist, I'm just walking around as a lawyer hoping somebody will slip and fall so I can get a lawsuit out of this.
For the record, I was a history major, so Judge, we got that in common, and I'm a lawyer. So law and history over here.
I won't out myself. So let's talk about change. And in particular, I think each of you are working in literally different environments. What are some of the big changes that you've seen over the last few years, maybe even decades, in the physical environment in which you work? And Dr. Stunz, you've done work all over the Gulf of Mexico, and I was in with some of your scientists who are working on coral reefs, and they were talking about some of the changes that we've seen there in water temperature, and obviously there are a lot of things going on along the coast in the work that you do at HRI. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, sure, Jay. And of course, you know, change, especially within a coastal or estuarine environment, is normal to some extent, and that's good, and then maybe not so good, of course, with a lot of the discussions we've had today on other things. And I think hearing the great water discussions that we were hearing about just in this last panel, but really the theme throughout the day, if you step back a little bit and you really look at, well, what's driving a lot of these issues that we're facing as coastal managers or conservationists or whatever, and it's really this population growth that we're seeing in Texas. And I mean, of course, we want to see a growing Texas and robust economies and that kind of thing. But it really, you know, pick your favorite demographer, but within our lifetimes, we're going to see, you know, double the Texas population likely. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, everybody wants to move to Texas, and then where do they want to recreate or perhaps live is on the coast. And of course, that's a good thing from an economic standpoint, but also that puts a lot of pressure on our natural resources. So we see things like water availability. We've got this really unique situation in Texas where if you look down from the Judges area up in Sabine, you're very water rich, as we were talking about in the last panel. As you move down to the middle and lower coast, we become very water poor. And that lifeblood to the estuary is what really drives all that productivity, all the economics, the multi-billion-dollar fisheries that they support, and of course all the habitats. And so we've seen tremendous change with not only freshwater availability, variety of reasons causing either habitat impairment or direct habitat loss. So there's a lot of room for improvement to offset that so we can maintain the robust populations and habitats that we have. And to give credit to the Parks and Wildlife, they do an outstanding job looking across the Gulf. We don't face near some of the problems that other places do, so we're in a great place. But we also have a lot of work and a lot of improvements we can get done as it relates to, in general, the habitats and things that support our resources.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think we're going to have a lot of commonalities here, right? So, I mean, we are worried about loving our coast to death, right? Because we just keep moving closer and closer. I was looking up some stats on percentage of U.S. population that lives in coastal counties, and it's something like 40% of our U.S. population lives in coastal counties. So think about that. You know, we've got this broad swath of land between the Atlantic Ocean and the West Coast, and we're all on the coast. We're concentrated on the coast, and it's only 10% of the land. So, you know, it causes issues. You know, our issues that happen in Galveston Bay, you know, that we're working on today. We do coastal restoration because we lost a lot of coastal resources, right? So we've lost wetlands, and we've lost seagrass, and we've lost oyster reef for a variety of reasons. You know, our wetlands loss was actually primarily driven by subsidence. Scott talked about relative sea level rise, and that includes the land sinking and the water rising. Well, we've had incredible amounts of subsidence you know, in the last 100 years in the Houston area because we were pumping so much groundwater out of our aquifers, primarily for industrial use, but also for residential use, or domestic use. And so we have now, fortunately, in some ways moved beyond pumping so much groundwater, and we use a lot more surface water, which causes its own issues for water flowing into Galveston Bay. But, you know, and that's because of just generally speaking population growth. Like, we've just grown and grown, and our industrial base has grown. And I also heard Marianne say that Harris County was growing at the second fastest pace of any county. So listen, I think every county in Texas claims to be growing as the fastest county. I know Fort Bend County claims they're growing super fast. Montgomery County. So, I mean, we're all dealing with that. And, you know, I guess it's because Texas is such a great place to live and do business. But, you know, we've got to invest back into the coast to ensure that our coast remains a healthy place.
Yeah, and just to chime in on the population growth, I think the stats are something like Texas statewide is the third fastest growing state in terms of population right now. And so you don't always think of this from, you know, a statewide lens because we're working with a vast degree of geographies across the state. But litter can become, anywhere in Texas can become marine debris. We have all these watersheds across the state, and any piece of trash that doesn't wind up in a landfill or a trash can is more than likely eventually going to make its way all the way down to the Gulf. And And so we see that there is, I think, a 10 times higher rate of marine debris on the Texas Gulf Coast than there is anywhere else on the Gulf Coast, perhaps the country. And so, you know, there are lots of drivers of that. Approximately half of the litter that you find comes from motorists and roadways. So individual behavior change is a big part of it. Of course, with population growth, you have construction and demolition. That's also a huge source and driver of litter and debris. And so, you know, really what we're hoping to do is start tracking these litter at its source to not only find out what impact it's having locally on watersheds and the interaction between litter, infrastructure, population, all sorts of different variables, but how to actually, you know, take that data and put some preventative measures in place and be able to actually measure the impact of different technologies for infrastructure.
So everything you're saying and more, and Jay, to answer your question, similarly, but not the same. To me, it really comes down, my observation is the biggest change is demand for coastal resources. And you see that on a number of fronts. And I'll just give you an example. Us anglers down on the lower coast, we always end up finding ourselves talking about, well, they just keep making more boats, but not more water, right? And so, you know, it's not just the burden that the utilizers of the resource cause that triggers the need for restoration, things like that, but it's the demand for resources like public boating infrastructure. So every time I turn around, I see either Parks and Wildlife or a local government or a conservation organization, they're adding on to a boat ramp parking lot. They're adding facilities, so it's that kind of stuff that goes hand in hand with the restorative piece that we're really here talking about, but it's the same group of people focusing on the same thing, and it all stems from demand for the resource.
Yeah, and to add on to, I think what we can hand off to you, Judge, is we have this huge amount of energy supply, and it all runs downhill to the coast, and you're living in a part of the country that's the largest petrochemical complex on the globe. And so can you talk about how you see the change in the physical world impacting what you have, which is a huge industry there in the Port Arthur area, and why you have been able to really amass a lot of support, both financially and from your constituents, to look at the wetlands, look at the shoreline in a way that's maybe in some ways selfish, like this does impact us if we don't protect it, but also for the benefit of you know, the environment on its own.
Yeah. I see it having had several problems that we've experienced over the last 30 years, the biggest of which I think is really a perception problem, because I've done a lot of work over the last 18 years at the Texas legislature and at the federal level, trying to advocate for coastal restoration, protection, and other issues. The problem is Texas is such a huge state that there's a stereotype out there by West Texas legislators that everybody along the coast is walking around in cutoff shorts and flip-flops and drinking a land shark. And they don't understand that, you know, my county, for instance, has 4 major refineries, 36 chemical plants, LNG plants, synthetic rubber plants that began during World War II. We've got the first and second largest refineries in the United States, and our air and water is still better than most of the other areas of the state. We've worked really hard over the last 30 years with attainment status. But our issues since 2005 have primarily been with natural disasters and with the long-lasting effects of what happened back in the 30s when the Corps of Engineers dug the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway and cut off the normal sheet flow of fresh water from the higher elevation marshes north of the intercoastal to the lower elevation marshes to the south. And Jefferson County is home to 138,000 acre Cheniere marsh that is the largest in Texas. It's really important for hunters and fishermen, bird watchers. It's really important as a finfish, crab, and shrimp nursery habitat. Texas Parks and Wildlife had told me that over 95% of the species in the Gulf of Mexico some point in their life cycle are dependent on those marshes for their survival. It's really important as a buffer against hurricane storm surge. We had 19 plus feet during Hurricane Ike in 2008, and had it not been for those marshes, that water would have been all the way up to Beaumont and would have done billions upon billions of dollars worth of damage. So it's really important that we protect it, but freshwater inflows, saltwater inundation, destruction by hurricanes of our beach dune system were the problems I was dealing with in 2007 when I came to the county. And as horrible as it was, the BP oil spill provided an opportunity for us to address those issues on a landscape scale that would not have been possible had we been dependent on local tax revenues, property tax revenues, to fund those restoration efforts. And my hat is off to Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas General Land Office, TCEQ, and all of them who have done such a outstanding job in shepherding these through the process. And if I get a chance to talk about them, but I have a tendency when I start talking about it to talk for 2 hours, so I'm going to hand back the...
Well, and I think you've been able to amass about, what, $140 million or so dollars over the last decade for restoration work?
We're over $200 million
Okay,
now.
200. Sorry, I was off by 60 million.
And, that's from all sources: Restore Council, NACA, working with Ducks Unlimited, Go Mesa, Kepra, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, federal disaster supplemental appropriations, everything. And we've got another $10 million coming from GLO for some more projects here in the next several months. We've got another $20 million coming from federal appropriations to complete the beach dune restorations from Seagram Park out to Texas Point, and which you, Jay, have walked in Chasing the Tide. So we're...
It's a beautiful beach.
Oh, and it'll be more beautiful.
Joe, since you have the mic, I actually want to shift a little bit and maybe come back this way or have folks chime in on the geopolitics and really the either the Gulf-wide or the global impact of what's happening on the Texas coast and how it impacts the rest of the world. We were talking about some of this as it relates to your business, and I just don't think that people realize, even in Texas, how important what's happening in those 18 coastal counties really is.
Sure. So in a nutshell, what Cheniere Energy does is we buy natural gas, domestically produced natural gas, and we cryogenically cool it, and we put it on ships, and we sail it to our customers around the world, many of which are allies in Europe. And in 03, 04, and 05, roughly half of our cargoes went to allies in Europe for geopolitical reasons. We expect the LNG market to roughly double by 2040. And so what you're seeing here is this rapid progression of permitting projects in Jefferson County, Middle Coast, Louisiana, all in the interest of serving that demand. Again, we talked about demand locally. It's the same nationally, and it's really multiple fold. It's to satisfy these geopolitical issues, but it's also to promote the decarbonization of energy around the world. So if you look at, and I might be getting ahead of the topics, but over the last 15 years, we've undergone a massive transition from coal-fired power generation to gas-fired power generation. And in way of doing so, we've reduced CO2 emissions in North America by over half a million metric tons. So if we take that model and we start servicing Europe, developing nations, et cetera, we think that's an important piece of the transition in decarbonizing energy production around the world. And that's what's also driving that massive demand. And you see that as we expand our facilities in Corpus Christi and Sabine Pass. That's all waterway dependent. That's where we get to the interface with some of these other groups. Yeah. But that's really it in a nutshell. That's what's driving us geopolitically and really environmentally as well.
Can I add something there, Jay? Because I think this is fascinating history, right? Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Cheniere was begun as a company, they intended to import
That's
LNG, right? So the U.S. was an importer of LNG, and then fracking happened. And all of a sudden, we have this massive supply of natural gas in the U.S., and we became a massive exporter. And it doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon. I mean, other than maybe some minor permitting issues, it's just fascinating to me that it changed so quickly from the U.S. you need to import LNG to now just becoming this massive exporter.
You're exactly right. Between 2002 and 2005, I spent, on average, about 70, 80 hours a week working on figuring out how to import natural gas.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's right.
To follow up on that, Jane, this brings up some interesting, whether we're talking about marine debris or these others, all these are really, in my opinion, somewhat of a silver lining or an opportunity to work together, such as industry and science, by the way. And this is something that our institute really champions, of where in Texas we kind of have this culture, this history, where we want to work with industry hand in hand with the science. The industry wants to do the right things. They may not always know what that is. There's plenty of really positive players that want to do that. Some maybe we'd like to see improvements on, but there's an opportunity there to accomplish some of our conservation goals. In addition, while the Deepwater Horizon was certainly a major disaster, there was a silver lining there, is that we have these resources, as the judge was talking about, that we will probably never have again. Hopefully not, from that reasoning. But what we want to be cautious of, though, is we want to make sure we don't really squander that. Right now, as many of you know, the money's not flowing quite as well as it is in Jefferson County. For some of the other counties, we'd like to see that flow a lot better and get that money into the hands of the folks that are really doing this restoration work. So we've definitely got some work to do there. But just from meetings like this and others that we have along similar lines, is that we tend to be on the same page. Everyone's kind of moving towards a good mission and goal. We just need to coalesce that a little bit more and really take advantage of those resources. And then I just one more just brief thing, as we were talking about your marine debris and your trash that you were talking about, just as an aside and as a comment that I think is also an opportunity. We also work on marine debris, but it's mainly has to do with things washing up from around the world on the beaches, but similar. And so at our institute, we're an academic institute, we have graduate students from around the world and all over the U.S. come in, and they are just appalled at the trash in Texas. I can't tell you how many times it's just this strange, as you bring that up, where that just, I guess, doesn't happen like that in other places, or the trash from the vehicles that you're talking about. And so clearly what that tells me is there's definitely a cultural thing there that's driving a lot of, why is that occurring? So I think there's a tremendous education opportunity. If it doesn't happen in other places, well, why is it happening here? And how can we go about really fixing that situation? So anyway.
Yeah, and go ahead, Kirsten.
Oh, I was going to say, and to your point, you raise a point that, we do have 10 times more trash, but it isn't all our fault because you do have things washing in from the Gulf Current. But again, if you really want to look at the geopolitical role of marine debris here, anything that washes its way from Texas into the Gulf is going to make its way into our oceans, right? So we want to be good neighbors. And Texans take so much pride in our state and in our communities. I think there's a lot of opportunity to really get folks involved. We're working from a citizen science angle here and engaging a lot of groups that are already doing these litter cleanups in their communities and helping to kind of amplify the impact of their work, and to really educate about the fact that anything that happens in the state of Texas litter-wise does impact the coast and impacts our oceans. So you're right, there's great opportunity there. And really the goal and the hope with the Texas Litter Database, we've talked a lot about, infrastructure, data, how to work with the public and educate the public. What we're really hoping to do with this tool is to not only collect data, but to very proactively show communities how they can use that data to, make better informed decisions in their communities about how to prevent that litter from reaching the Gulf, because prevention is always the most powerful strategy. It's a lot harder to remove plastic from our oceans than it is to stop it from getting there to begin with. And so to that end, Keep Texas Beautiful is actually partnering with the Gulf Trust on the Trash Free Gulf campaign that's launching this spring. And so Jay and Christy have engaged 40 some communities across the state to do, litter cleanups on watersheds. The goal is to prevent 800 tons of trash from reaching the Gulf, which is an incredible goal. So we're really excited to be a part of that. But there are a lot of really powerful educational components as well. So it's really exciting to be able to bring this degree of attention to the problem and to reach and engage so many more communities on a broader scale.
This is fascinating and really informative work for people like us in industry. So for years we've done these volunteer cleanups and things, and until I started doing that kind of work, I admit I had fallen into the trap of, oh, that's just international stuff that we can't control, and it just ended up here. And then we get out and we start doing the work, and depending on where you are, you make these observations like that's from our neighborhood, or that's from wherever. And I won't name any names, but you see these kind of common names that end up, these brands that come down the creeks and end up on, whether it's a Rookery Island or whatever. So the work you're doing is going to be both fascinating and so informative to the general public and us in industry, so that we're just better educated on, the first question is, where's this stuff come from? And then you work towards solving it, right?
Can we talk about that? Or go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was just going to, so I live right next to Buffalo Bayou in Houston, and it's not the prettiest place after it rains, right? I mean, stuff is coming down all of our bayous, and it gets into Galveston Bay. But I think there's also, at least anecdotally, a success story here. We do a trash cleanup, a regional trash cleanup in the Houston area called Trash Bash, and it's been going on for 20 plus years, and it's at like 14 or 15 different sites, and they catalog how much trash each site picks up on an annual basis, and those numbers are going down, right? So we're seeing less trash. There's still way too much, don't get me wrong, but at least at the sites where we're having, we have a site in Armin Bayou where we have 600 volunteers picking up trash on one morning. And I often actually worry, are we going to be able to keep those volunteers busy for the whole morning? Because in some of the places, they're just not the trash that we used to see. So I think there's good things going on, and now there's need for more, Jay. So I absolutely welcome what you're trying to do as well, and GBF is going to be
You're
part
a partner.
of it. Yeah, there we go. The more trash cleanup we can do, and the more cataloging of where the trash comes from, so then we can try to work on eliminating the source, the better. But again, we have made some good progress. So I think it's worth noting.
Let's talk about, because it's a huge problem, right? But it's one of many. There are a lot of challenges, and I think the way that we and our partners look at it is it's an opportunity to raise awareness about a particular problem. But the Gulf is a difficult place to truly understand because you have to get in it, and in some cases, if it's the wrong time of year, you have to get bit by mosquitoes in the process. It's not like the Rocky Mountains or something where you can go up to a 10,000 or 12,000 foot peak, take a view, and understand what it is that you're surrounded by. And so it's a way to really connect people with their environment, with the coast, and then give them an action that they can take. And then with the data, we can get back to them and say, hey, look, you may think that you only picked up 12 pieces of trash, but statewide, this is what you were able to do. And so what role does communication play in the work that you all are doing and raising awareness about the issues and the challenges and the solutions to the work that you're doing?
Well,
or do you want to answer a different question?
No, that's fine. I think the reason that I carry a gun nowadays and don't let my wife drive is because if she sees somebody litter, she's going to chase them down and threaten them. And I was speaking at a Gulf of Mexico Alliance meeting in Gulf Shores, Alabama several years ago, and became aware of a group that goes around and they put up, in effect, nets in drainage ways and so forth to capture litter. Thought it was great. And just recently, over the last year, I've been talking to LNG companies and others about, in industry, as well as our drainage districts, about trying to put those in Jefferson County to stop that. One of the great things we got going on now is we've got ExxonMobil recently announced an advanced plastics recycling center in Beaumont, which will start construction relatively soon. But education and communication is going to be paramount to trying to get people to appreciate the impacts that litter has on the ecosystem.
Yeah, and Jay, I would add, obviously as a professional educator, we think communicating and education is going to be really key to what are many of our problems, whether it's trash or habitat loss or whatever. It's pretty amazing to think, and especially in light of the Texas population growth, many of these folks will not be educated to the problems that we have. Many people don't know 99% of the freshwater inflow is cut off from Corpus Christi Bay, which is a challenge, or they don't even know why freshwater reaching the bay is important. Or, for example, they think water reaching the bay is a waste because everyone in Austin could be drinking it, or whatever. So, there's a whole suite of educating maybe more educated people or professionals or adults. So there's a definite challenge, and we all have, I would say, as a running an institute that has education outreach arms, we're not doing near the job that we could. And we all could do a lot better to having people understand why do they need to care about the Bay, or why should someone in Dallas, Texas care about the coast and what they do here, and how we are connected through rivers to the Bay and ultimately to the ocean. But then also educating our youth. As there are going to be more people, there are going to be more youth that don't understand why we need to care and conserve resources. And we've been doing a lot of thought in getting information and teaming up with some really great groups to get coastal curriculum into the classroom. And by the way, it's third grade is when these kids that's when they decide how they're going to feel about the environment. That's the latest kind of research. So that's the group that you really got to target, or those young children that's when they're really forming their opinions. Hopefully that carries into adulthood. And then of course we have to educate those that are there about why in general do they need to care about conservation. But I think the really underpinning problem or thing there is that if they don't experience it, they can't appreciate it. And that's why I know nearly all of our groups have some educational opportunities or ways to get kids involved, or adults even involved, to really experience. And once they create an oyster reef, for example, whether you're a kid or adult, and you can come back in 10 years and go, wow, I made that reef, that really makes a difference in terms of how you see the marine environment. So hands-on education as well as sort of academic learning is going to be really key for conserving our natural resources in the state.
Yeah, hopefully I'll tell a funny story here related to EarthX, but just in general, communicating with people and getting their attention is super important. And almost everything we do, we try to get people involved and sort of tell them why we're doing it, so they could then hopefully have a long-term care. And so we Galveston Bay Foundation came up to EarthX probably 10 or 12 years ago, maybe even longer, when it was over by the Cotton Bowl, and there was a much bigger kind of exhibiting opportunity. We put up an exhibit. We had a couple staff members, and it says, "Dallas has a bay," and so people were just so confused by it, right? I mean, we were trying to make the point that our watershed, the Galveston Bay watershed, starts north of Dallas-Fort Worth. Right? It's the Trinity River that brings down the majority of the fresh water to Galveston Bay. And even at an EarthX conference, people are like, no, Dallas, we have a bunch of lakes, but we don't have a bay. And so it was fascinating talking to people and trying to get them to try to make a funny point so that they would remember, all the water, or actually when people flush a toilet in Dallas, that water comes down the Galveston Bay. So just wanted to make that kind of fun connection for the public.
Can we shift a little bit to habitat, because at the federal level right now there's a discussion around habitat versus species, and if you think about habitat on the coast, a lot of it you can see, but a lot of it is you can't see unless you're in a boat and you understand what it is that you're in and around. We're in the middle of two flyways, the Central Mississippi Flyway. We've got marine species that are born in our bays and estuaries that ultimately end up in the Gulf. What are some of the things that you all are doing as far as habitat restoration or conservation goes? We touched a little bit on Cheniere, and you talked a little bit about oysters, and Bob, a lot of your work. Even Cheniere is doing some work in and around coral. Can y'all talk about what that work is like? Because it's changing, but I think we're, as humans, a part of also restoring it in the process.
I guess I can start, Jay, and as being an institute where, I can't hardly think of a project we work on that doesn't have some type of habitat connection. I mean, everything we're talking about, if you don't have this foundational species in the coastal environments like seagrasses and marshes and oyster reefs, and even non-vegetated bottom is important, just the mud bottom, you're not going to have the ecosystem. So it's fundamental. And the real double-edged sword we have is that if you're in fisheries, for example, you want to recruit anglers, but when you recruit more anglers, it's more pressure on the habitats and the resource. So, you've got to find these balances, but protecting what we have, that's the best thing to do. And then, trying to improve those that are impaired, and then outright restoration. And those are different costs for each one of those is really where we need to be. And, our institute is working very heavily on that. As you heard Dr. Jenny Pollock up here, or maybe Keisha Barr, who you'll hear in the next session on coral reefs, their whole careers they've devoted their lives around protecting and restoring those habitats. So there's a bright future there, but it's a lot of work, it's expensive, and we just need that buy-in. So if you looked at what we're doing, one is awareness, two is outright, through Jenny's Sink Your Shucks program, similar to what Bob's doing in Galveston Bay. You're taking shells that would end up in a landfill and getting them back in the bay where they belong. But there's also erosion's a big problem. We haven't really talked about that in these sessions today, just briefly in some of them. Eroding the habitats is a big deal. The land goes, well, the habitats go with it. And so preventing that is another big deal. So we focus a lot on that. And then what are the changes going to look like in the future, and how do we deal with that? So we need to be thinking about that now. Living shorelines are a big deal. We harden a lot of shorelines through jetties and revetments and rocks and that sort of thing. And that works, but it's probably not as good as a living marsh that's actually doing things ecologically. But if we don't have that foundational species, the ecosystems are not going to function the way they were intended. So.
Yeah, just real quick, one of the things that when my wife and I were doing this project, and we walked the Texas coast. When you get down to the Laguna Madre and the upper part near Baffin, and you look at sea level rise projections to like 2050, a lot of the freshwater ponds that are on the west side of the Laguna are potentially going to be underwater. And you think, well, we'll just drill wells or do whatever. But then you think about 80% of the redhead duck population winters in the upper Laguna Madre. Their blood levels become hypersaline, and so they have to flush their system to get the levels back down. And they use fresh water to do that, and they need to expend as little energy as possible to do that. And so you start to make these connections and realize, we have time. We know. That's the thing is, it's not 1900. Like, we know what's coming, at least, with some degree of certainty, and so we can plan for it. Bob?
Well, just habitat restoration in general, I've referenced it earlier. The Galveston Bay Foundation was formed in 1987, had its first employee in 1989, and did its first habitat restoration project in 1991. So we've been doing habitat restoration projects for over 30 years at this point. And the reason that's one of our sort of bread and butter things is, again, I mentioned this earlier too, because we've lost a lot of those habitats, right? And so we've lost wetlands and oyster reef. I mean, Pat Murray referenced it this morning. They used to just dig up oyster shell from Galveston Bay to build roads with, right? And that was a big process that happened through the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. And it wasn't until the 70s that Texas Parks and Wildlife Department outlawed that. And so we lost a lot of our natural reefs. And so there's an opportunity to do restoration. Now, it's not cheap, it's not easy necessarily, but there's a great need because now we have such demand for oysters as well from a fishery standpoint. So, and we've been fortunate, the judge referenced it, Deepwater Horizon has provided a lot of money for a lot of great projects over the last 10 plus years. Some of those pots of money are already used up, which is both a good thing and a bad thing because we've got some really good projects that have happened. There's still money out there though. There's still NERDA money. There's still Restore money. And so, I won't get into the other federal sources, the bill and the IRA. We're providing a lot of money. That may be pausing a little bit, unfortunately, but habitat restoration will still be something that we work on for, the rest of, the time that we're in operation.
Yeah.
So I picked on the anglers earlier and all their fishing boats, and now I'll switch to the shippers. So with all this increased demand on coastal resources, you also get more ships. And with more ships, you get waterway improvements. And with waterway improvement projects, you have dredge material. And 20 years ago, this concept of beneficial use, it was there, and we used dredge material if it was the right grain size for beach nourishments. But for the most part, there were these regulatory headwinds that precluded us from doing a lot of good projects that were in the best interest of all of our stakeholders. And we ended up putting it in an upland confined placement area, and that was it. And that's where it sits today. If you look at I'll just point out the Port of Corpus Christi because that's my home port, and they've done a heck of a job. If you look at a map of the Corpus Christi ship channel from 20 years ago at their placement areas, you see a handful of upland confined placement areas, and that's about it because that's all they could get in their environmental impact statement. If you look at today's map of the Corpus Christi ship channel, you see these BU projects all up and down the channel, ranging from bird islands, seagrass, erosion protection, across the board, like the entire range of restoration projects, you're seeing it along the waterways, and that's been a big win for the industry, the port, the regulators, and the conservation communities. So a big part of the restoration dynamic, I think, these days that hopefully we'll see more of.
And just to plug for HRI and some of the work that Dale Govlick's doing there on the Cindy project and looking at how to prioritize based on environmental conditions over the next few decades or more, where is the best place to put some of that as it relates to birds? And you know more about it than me.
Yeah, it turns out these beneficial use areas for the dredge spool make great nesting and colonial areas for those type of birds. And but it turns out not all of these islands are the same. Some are really successful, some aren't successful at all. Typically, there's not a lot of predators on them, is why they make good islands. And so we're working hard, in fact, with Joe and others, to really figure out, well, if you're limited in material, you're limited in time and money, how do you maximize the success of your restoration program? In this case, we're talking about marine birds. But yeah, so there's, and that's another way I was talking about where industry and ecology can work hand in hand to, they've got issue with where do you put the dredge material? We can make good bird nesting habitats if you apply the best science to that. So, and I do have to say, with the shipping, having been on the bay on just a routine basis all the time, I've seen an accelerated rate of erosion. The amount of energy and water moved by these ships is pretty astonishing. Literally in Port Aransas, people are surfing behind them. That's the level of waves that they generate. So I see islands and places eroding much more quickly than they did when I first was there in the 90s. So we've got a lot of work to do there with beneficial materials that could really help offset some of this erosion that we've seen.
Yeah, and we during the building of the Golden Pass LNG project, they did a Boodum project to restore 2,700 acres in Sea Rim State Park, working with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and replanted it afterwards. It's been a fabulous success. Sempra Energy is working with Texas Parks and Wildlife on another project. We're working with the Corps of Engineers on an ecosystem restoration project a little bit to the west of the Keith Lake system. But, our problems were hurricane problems. Storm surge completely knocking out our beach dune system, leaving clay, which eroded at a much more rapid rate than the traditional recession and redeposition of sand by wave action. And so we were getting salt water from the south. We had a channel that had been built on the east side of the Cheniere system in 77, which had eroded to 4 or 5 times its original size, which needed a saltwater barrier in it. We had the decreased flows because of the intercoastal waterway. So we put siphons under the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. We put a saltwater barrier there. We rebuilt, working with GLO, and plugged to Kelly Brooks, who did such a yeoman's job on that project. And we've got a lot more work to do. We could easily use another $200 million, but since we're doing a waterway improvement project right now, we're working with the navigation district to harness as much Boodum as we can to Dr. Hoach is here from Lamar University. He's working on a big project on the north end of Pleasure Island, which will create hopefully a really important nursery habitat. And I better stop.
Can I? Yeah, because I think you may be able to answer this, because I see Andy Sansom in the back there, and I got a note a couple days ago from Ellen Temple about the fact that land conservation sometimes isn't connected with water conservation. And I think, Bob, all of us know that land equals habitat. Habitat has a lot of different values. We've kind of talked about that here. And Bob, I know that's been part of what you all have been trying to do in and around the Galveston Bay area. And you talk about some of the benefits of that kind of land conservation as it relates to wildlife habitat and water, and that maybe help us segue into water a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, just land conservation as a whole is going to have benefits to water in a lot of ways. Marianne talked about flood storage, coastal prairies, and lots of areas around the bay absorb and hold water. They provide storm surge protection, which the judge talked about. They provide water quality benefits as well, because the water will cleanse itself as it runs through the wetlands. So there's a giant connection between water and land. We did a really interesting project with Texas Water Trade within the last couple of years, where we had a conserved piece of property that we purchased water for, because we wanted to sort of pulse the water into this little mini estuary as drought conditions came up. And of course, luck would have it that as soon as we purchased that water, we had like 3 or 4 years of floods. So didn't actually need the water for a while. But then things started to dry up, and we were able to, use the water in a very positive way to put water on this land. A lot of the land held water in the wintertime for waterfowl purposes, but didn't keep water in the summertime. So we were able to pulse that water onto this piece of property in the summertime and do some research about the improved benefits in the little mini estuary that was there. So that's a lot of fun, but certainly land and water are directly connected, and there are super benefits to water for doing all kinds of land conservation and restoration work.
Joe, just out of curiosity, does water play into how you all operate at all in Cheniere, where you're located on the coast?
Depends on where we are. At Sabine Pass in southwest Louisiana, we consume far more water than we do in Corpus Christi. We use a different technology due to the abundance of water in southwest Louisiana. We use very little water in Corpus Christi, so not really as much. Our main issue with water is that it's our gateway to our customers, so it's more in the salt water and starting at the estuary all the way to the open ocean.
Yeah. What gives you all, we've talked about a lot of different issues, erosion and habitat loss and marine debris. What gives you hope as you, Sarah kind of ended her panel with this, there's just a lot going on, right? But what gives you all hope for the future and some of the work that you're doing?
I'll kick that one off. Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of opportunity. There's meetings like this in groups and everyone getting on the same page. I mean, we live certainly in a resource limited environment, but it's not that limited. We could be in a much worse situation, and kind of back to the whole point of the settlement from the Deepwater Horizon. So, that gives me hope. When you look at what we're doing, and I would say practically every group, and maybe many of your groups in this room have some kind of educational piece to what you're doing and making sure, especially those young kids, are trained on how they feel about the environment. I think there's a lot of hope there, and people are starting to become aware that, we're directly tied to the environment. In fact, everyone's tied to the ocean. The air we're breathing right now is from the ocean for the most part. So getting that word out that people need to everyone benefits from a healthy marine environment and healthy coasts and healthy water supply. So there's definitely hope there that, I would say we all have a lot of job security in this room in terms of there's plenty of work to do. Don't get me wrong. But, I think the tides are turning, so to speak, and, it's pretty positive moving forward if we can do the right things.
Yeah, I would just say, I was talking to somebody earlier and maybe at lunch talking about how all of us in this business have to be optimists, right? We cannot be a glass half empty kind of person. You have to be a glass half full. And so, there's just hope that what we are doing makes a difference. And, you have to believe that. And I think there's good evidence that what we are doing does make a difference. The health of Galveston Bay is much, much improved today compared to when the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. There were no fish that lived anywhere close to the Houston Ship Channel in 1972, and today there are dolphins that go up into the Houston Ship Channel because there's so many fish to eat. So you just have to believe in difficult times, and I would argue that this is a difficult time for those in conservation right now. But you have to believe in your long-term staying power, and you have to believe that people understand the value of what you're doing and will continue to invest in it even when there's a bunch of noise on the side, right? So that's where when I wake up in the morning, those are the kinds of things I have to sort of tell myself. And I believe it because we have good people in this room, and people are generally good as well. And we're going to keep doing some really good work.
Before you say anything, Kirsten, I think just on that, the interesting thing is I think we've been preparing for this moment for a very long time in Texas because we have had to work with private-public partnerships. We're 95% privately owned state. We don't rely necessarily on obviously big projects. We do, like the judge, federal and state funding, but we've had to be creative. And I think if anybody can do it and be optimistic, that we can in this moment.
I think people tend to be a bit surprised about how optimistic I am because litter is sort of a depressing topic. But I've been lucky to see firsthand how much potential there is, especially in working with this statewide tool. There's so much for us to learn. Being that this is the first statewide litter database, we're able to, again, we're looking at trash, where it ends up, mapping it, where we find it. And we're also able to get really granular data on what the composition of that trash is and where it winds up. For example, the statewide trend is you're going to find 74% plastics, but on the coast, you're going to find more styrofoam. So we're able to see how trash interacts with different environments. But when we actually understand what's happening and where, we can make better informed decisions around things like infrastructure. As others have talked about, there's a big investment to make. And with so much at stake, we want to make sure we're making the right choice, right? So we can take that data to help inform those decisions, but then we can also actually really study if those solutions are working, which is not sometimes the piece that gets lost. And with the statewide project, we can then amplify and share those findings with other communities across Texas, and it's really that collaboration and working together that helps drive those solutions. So there's a lot to learn there. And then to the education piece, I think beyond working with youth and, the obvious components of there's litter is bad, and them coming home and telling parents don't do that. But there's a lot of really interesting opportunities with technology as well. And because this is a statewide project, we've been able to work with smaller communities, larger municipalities to apply for grants for infrastructure where you can look at some really cutting edge technologies like bubble curtains. There are, I can't remember the name, but there are technologies that you can deploy remotely onto water to pick up trash. Buffalo Bayou Partnership, for instance, has a very interesting and innovative technique where they actually have a trash suction boat that goes out and vacuums up large quantities of trash. And when you have that, you can also work in conjunction with like STEAM centers and actually get kids out there learning about the technologies and interacting with those technologies. So it can be a really fantastic education source, especially in communities where there might not be much access otherwise.
So the people in this community give me more hope than anything. And I mean that in a couple of ways. First, there's, in the coastal zone, there's a really neat combination of seasoned experts with a lot of wisdom that have so much to offer, and I hope they're not going anywhere, but they do a great job for the conservation community. And then couple that with some really remarkable emerging leaders, and I think we're going to hear from some of those in a panel, either the next one or the one after that. But there's some really great people up and coming that are taking the reins and running with them in new ways with creative ideas, and that's all great. But what's most remarkable to me is just the quality of collaboration in this space, and a lot of that stems, I think, from kind of the coastal community being so tight-knit. Now, I don't know how many miles of shoreline we have on the Texas coast, but it's a lot. But
367.
But it's a relatively small, tight-knit group, and many of us started working together in college or in graduate school and in our first jobs, and we've gone separate ways, but we've stayed in related space. And what that results in is we know who to call when something comes up. So when one of the NGOs has an issue, they don't hesitate. They know where to look to solve problems. So it's an excellent group of collaborators and problem solvers, and that gives me a lot of hope.
And I would include you in that group as well. We sat down a couple of years ago when the Gulf Trust was getting started, and I remember you may not remember what you said, but he said, "Hey, this all sounds great, but I really don't want to waste my time on something unless it's going to make a difference." And so that was a big charge for me and everyone else involved. But I think we have that. You've heard from Pat Murray earlier. You heard from this panel before, Marianne, all the people that are involved in conservation that touches the coast, and then on the research side, care so much. And I think that's more than half the battle, right, with all of this. And so I would include, you, Joe, and industry along the coast. I think maybe Greg, you said they just want to do the right thing, right? They just need to know what that is.
Yeah, and I would just parrot what everybody else said. It would be collaboration. We've been really fortunate. I think the looking back to when I started at county in 2007 to the present day, found much more collaboration between the state agencies, Parks and Wildlife, GLO, TCQ, and even some of the federal agencies. I'd say much better collaboration between units of local government and industry, with a willingness on the part of industry to contribute to projects that are going to make a meaningful difference in the landscape of the community and contribute to the long-term success. I know I can trust each of you with a secret, but for the last several years I've been squirreling away Go Mesa funding coming to the county without telling my commissioners. So next Tuesday we're going to have a workshop with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and Ducks Unlimited to discuss how we can leverage about $10 million to, whether it be on carbon sequestration, living shoreline projects, doing preliminary engineering and design to make projects shovel ready, whether we contribute money for match to KEPRA projects, and I'm just really optimistic about the level of cooperation and collaboration, and more of a willingness to listen to what we have to say about the health of the coast. And incidentally, since we keep talking about everybody moving to Texas, whenever I travel out of state, do what I do, and that is tell everybody, Texas is a really horrible place. You don't want to come there.
Well, I think unless someone has something they really want to impart on the crowd, I think I may give everyone the gift of time. And before we get this next break, and will y'all give this panel a round of applause, please? Thank you.